right, we are in the book of Esther. We're going to be looking at chapter 9 here this morning. But we're going to just, again, take another look through just to put it into the context of where we are in our account. We're dealing with the 5th century BC during the Achaemenid dynasty, which was the Persian Empire. You have on the throne one of the key figures recognized in history in Xerxes during that time period. He was the third major king following Cyrus and Darius, in that he comes in as the Darius' son, and the empire is really going full force at this point. He is in Susa or Shushan is how the Bible gives it. That's a historical place. They had more than one place that were royal kind of palace areas, and one was being built during this period as well. You might later see Persepolis, Persia City, is essentially what that means. And so you have all of this. But I want us, as we've gone through now this far through the book, I want you to consider again what this main theme is and why this book exists in the biblical canon. And that is, while other examples do exist already in Scripture, this is the most specific to talk about completely and directly, and that's a key, God's providence, and that what that meant for the Jews during this time period. But I would argue it is even more significant when understood through the larger lens of Scripture, of why that it was so significant and necessary for the Jews to be delivered from this. And it all goes back to the promise that God originally made to Abraham. And so he's going to keep that promise, which is just kind of implied by the way in which Mordecai approached Esther, that God would provide this for his people because he still wasn't done with them. And this is even in captivity, which is interesting that it happens post-captivity. It's under a dominant nation. They are still subject to Persia, but they're not technically in captivity. They've been allowed to return. Well, if you recall, the prophets pointed out that they did not survive captivity because they were a great people. It was only because of God's plan, and he had something else for them, that they were allowed to survive. So then you come here, now about a little more than half a century past that point where they've come back. And now they're under this new kind of problem after having survived their original captivity. But the fact that God would go ahead and deliver them from captivity, which was around, when they came out around 536, that they would allow them to rebuild and finish rebuilding the temple, which was completed in 516. And that now with this new threat, that's kind of in their background. And so they have a record of God keeping his promises, and he still has a purpose for them that is the unspoken, at least in this book, background of the book. And that's important for us to really get a sense of this as more than just a nice story, that it serves a very important purpose in Scripture. Now, what we did, going through again to see how this story is laid out by the Holy Spirit, is you start by establishing the character of the ruler, Xerxes, as he is dealing with Vashti. And then the replacement now, which is the first hint that of what's all this is going on, is there's something else involved, because you end up with Esther taking her place as a Jew, keeping that quiet, and here she comes out of nothing as an orphan, and she's raised up to be the queen. Then this little vignette is inserted about Mordecai's deliverance. Notice that theme? Deliverance of Xerxes from a plot. Now, we didn't talk about this much, but now I want overall, having seen all these kind of themes develop, you realize that what has happened ultimately is that Mordecai and Esther, through their efforts, delivered Xerxes first. And then what we saw most recently is through the intervention of Mordecai and Esther that Xerxes is part of delivering them. So there's this beautiful kind of symmetry in a literary way. It's just, every time you think you've got all the layers down that is going on in this book, you see something new. It is just written that well. So we get to the problem in chapter 3 when Haman comes on the scene. He's presented as this high up now, basically second in command narcissist. And if you don't, come in and bow down to him, then you're a bad person. Mordecai doesn't, so what do? Well, not only does Mordecai need to die, but because that's based upon his being a Jew, then all the Jews need to die, and there's your conflict, which produces the need for a decision with Esther being provoked into doing something by Mordecai. She has to decide. She does this then by having what I start the chapter 5 as a trial run banquet. Let's see how everything goes. First of all, does the king accept me? And then let's see if we can get in his good graces for a day. And then we had in chapter 6 what we call flipping the script, where everything is going at this point. It looks like it is doom and gloom. And Haman is on the march. He's on the rise. And then Xerxes can't sleep. They read about his reign. That tells you something about him too. Okay, so they read about his reign, and it comes across this story, going back to chapter 2, about Mordecai helping to save him. What's been done for this man? So what does he say? I need to honor him. We need to honor him. And this is where everything flips around, because Haman's coming in to request to be able to take him out and kill him on the gallows he built. And instead, as he's approached about honoring someone. He thinks it's him, suggests the greatest kind of royal honors you could have except for becoming king. And the king says, that sounds good, you go do that for Mordecai. And everything flips. And now he's realized, well, we've got a problem here. What's going on? Well, that's when you find at the end now, we had the second part of the banquet that next day, after all this has happened. And this is where Esther lays out and goes after Haman and tells the king and reveals what Haman's done, which leads to Haman's being taken. So what do we get in chapter 8? Is we're going to get a solution to this problem. And that's where all of this is, I said, a new hope, because now there's another decree that's designed to combat the previous decree. And so that's going to solve the problem that the Jews are not going to be completely annihilated as a result of this. And there's the climax of the story. That brings us then to our text today. The Jews strike back. I'm glad that y'all caught that, yes. We had a new hope last week. We had to have the Jews strike back this week. Okay. So y'all react more than the students do. Okay, well, all right. They probably haven't seen the movie. All right, so here's how this is going to lay out in chapter 9, 1 through 17. Notice I'm breaking this down. We're just looking at verses 1 through 17 right now. And essentially what you have here, and I call it the case for self-defense, because you realize that's what's happening. That's the way in which this has been approached. Is because of this decree, the decree is not flipping everything and the Jews kill everybody automatically. They were basically allowed to defend themselves. And that's what was put before them, was you can defend yourselves. And with what went into the decree, with what Mordecai and Esther put in there, you're going to see emphasized in the text, they did not take plunder. Now remember that the whole idea originally, if you go back, because of the nature of these decrees and how they worked, one of the aspects that Haman put within his decree was the benefit of killing off all the Jews is you get all their stuff. And it's emphasized here that's not what the Jews did. The Jews in their decree did not flip that around and automatically. The king did give them, remember, he had already given Esther the household of Haman. But it was not about plunder. So there you have a contrast of character about what was done, that it was just for the self-defense and the preservation of the nation. So you start off with verse 1, in which it gives the basic information, which is important because it's telling us, okay, the time's come. Before it's been about the decree, all of that had happened fairly quickly. We've now gone a number of months. Remember that this happened, it started at the beginning of the year. You've had a little bit of time in between, but now we've had the stretch through the end of the year, and we're now at the end, and that's when all of this is going to happen. So it's going to detail for us, and the rising action is the fighting. They've had the decree, the day has come, now we've got to fight. So they do. And so you get down to verse 15. I'm not sure why, I've got 7 down there, so that's wrong. You come down and you have 15 is the climax, and then, okay, now that they've preserved themselves, what are we going to do from this? What's happening? How does everyone feel about it? There's a lot of rejoicing that goes on because the day has come and the decree has allowed us to defend ourselves and everything's good, so that they were able then to rest and enjoy, notice, feasting and gladness. And the idea that's important there when you get there, they rested, but it was gladness. That's what kind of tips you off that that's the end of that story. It's telling you how you should feel. They felt this way, you should feel this way. But what again did we have at the end of the story? What did they do? There's a feast. There's another theme, okay, that continues through this book. Once more, we have feasting. All right, so the main characters throughout this are Xerxes, who is still our ruler, Mordecai, who's explored, that is the pushing the boundaries of what's going on more, but Esther is operating a little bit more of a sage in terms of a brief time of giving advice. Mainly, this is a review simply of fighting, so it's a harder idea as a story to put together. So let's take a look now at the text, beginning in verse 1. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. Now I want to stop right there. There are actually 2 decrees, right? Okay, so, but there's the one that matters is also going into effect, so it's treated as one. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. Now, what do we have happening then just by the wording of that last part? What ideas just happened? Just like what happened with Haman, the flipping of the script, is that it's actually stated within the text. It's putting that situation up there. The enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. That was the first decree. The opposite occurred. So in the same way that Haman had planned to be honored, and instead he ends up honoring his mortal enemy, in the same way, then the Jews as a whole, their enemies who are planning to defeat them, kill them off, and take all their stuff, the opposite occurred, and the Jews were able to overpower those who hated them. So it's both, if you'll notice the wording, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. Notice this, the opposite occurred in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. So and hated and enemies is a related idea and word. Okay, so if you look even how it's put together, word-wise, did you notice how it runs together, and in the middle it says the opposite, and then the words totally flip? That's just a nice thing about how things are written. So that's the background. So what you're looking at is, what does it tell you? What led to this conflict? Well, that was that original decree. Okay? But the point is that D-Day arrives. This is the day that was originally when they cast lots. Here's when it's going to be. And the day has arrived. So now what's going to happen? And this is just, notice, he's just overviewed. He's already told you how everything comes out, right? Very first verse. We haven't had the record of any of the fighting yet. But he's already told you how it comes out. Now, that's either really bad storytelling or that's actually not the point. Remember we said that last week that the decree, once that second decree was made, that's why that was the climax of the story. It's treated as the climax of the story. This is the falling action of the book. All this is it's a foregone conclusion from that point, and that's how it's treated here in verse 1. It's treated as a foregone conclusion that the Jews would win. Going back to God's on their side. God's protected them, even though that's never said. So now that's anticipation somewhat of, well, how? What happened? Now the reason why for this too is, what we'll get to later on, is why the book was written in terms of its very first reason for being written, that we'll get to later in this chapter, is because they wanted to make sure all the Jews remembered this. Okay, that is, but here's the thing. Would it have been any surprise to a Jew living in 400 BC that the Jews had not been wiped out around the 470s BC? Right? If there were people that didn't understand that part of it, then they would have had to do a little bit more work. Okay, they knew. It was all in the how. So therefore, it was laying out the story. Here's what really mattered. And now we get to, here's how things played out. All right, so now we get to the rising action, which in a clue is when you're dealing with a fight, guess what rising action involves? Well, a lot of fighting. So let's read. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. Now, we had hints of this last week, or 2 weeks ago. We had the hints of that. Everyone started saying, oh, we need to not get in the Jews' way. We saw that at the end, and now they've had a few months with Mordecai as second in command. So you've had some months. It's not dictated in the text, but just the shift in the time frame should give you a clue that there's been time for that idea to build. That Mordecai is someone to be respected. You don't mess with him. And this has gone out for the Jews, and so you don't get in that way. All of these people, the satraps and governors, the officials in the province, anybody who was doing the king's work, guess who they were actually hearing from and answering to? Mordecai, right? So this last thing, when it's coming down from Mordecai, okay, we better get in line. They were afraid of Mordecai. He had that kind of power. Here's why. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace. I mean, he wielded a lot of power. And his fame spread throughout all the provinces. And we say fame, all that really means is everybody knew who Mordecai was. For this man, Mordecai became increasingly prominent. So notice how much attention is given to this is all the political situation. This is a huge shift. And again, what you say, why do you go into this? Go back and look at chapter 3, because that's kind of how Haman was in chapter 3. And just like everything had been flipped around in chapter 6, now with all of this being taken care of, now Mordecai is in the position of power within the empire as next to the king. So then it says, thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. That does not sound very nice. I was waiting for someone to say that. Is it, what happened in this? Well, what is the background, though? These people that were trying to kill them. And if we just took this on their own, as they went around the streets and just kind of selecting people and killing them, well, that's part of the thing that was going on, is that these were the people who, that's what they were doing to the Jews, and now you've got the back. So it's an ugly, messy war situation.
I find it very telling that God used men and put them in high positions to save his people, the Jewish nation. Like if you look at Jacob, and you look at, here, but when he saved all people, he sent Christ in a lowly position.
He
said, he put, to save the Jewish people, it was all, he put men in very high positions to save his people. Save all nations and all people.
But in the lowest, yeah.
The low position.
Yeah, and I think that is, that's telling. I think part of the reason why is that, and to kind of summarize where Son's going here, is that something like Joseph, which ended up delivering that family and made the nation possible. Daniel was raised up, which was key for a number of reasons for the benefit of the nation. And now Esther and Mordecai are put up for the nation. I do think, besides the spiritual theological lesson of Jesus providing deliverance from the opposite end of being the victim of that, essentially that nation, that great ruling nation. You can understand and appreciate, though, why they would be expecting a deliverer similar. That's how God had done it before. He'd raised someone up, and he had delivered them by putting them in some kind of political position. So it would make sense if that's all you were reading and how you were envisioning this. Now, there were other things in the text that they had trouble with, and that's why they decided they kind of viewed it as two or three different kind of people. They separated the idea of the Messiah who would be king from, in terms of the son of David, from the suffering servant. But your point is well made that God changed that. He flipped it around entirely. I think one of the reasons, too, that why that makes so much sense, besides the theological necessity of it as a sacrifice, he was no longer delivering a nation. He was delivering individuals. So he doesn't put him in a position as where he's operating and delegating to other people and doing this, but rather it's personal. And it is not that. So I think there are a lot of layers to what you're saying. So it is still a good point. So everyone fine, or you want to talk about what they did to these people? They're killing people, right? Now we're going to get the numbers. Okay, so this is a slaughter, but this is what had to happen. David.
But everybody had their chance to see which way the wind was blowing in this, right?
That's okay. Yes, is that you had your opportunity to say, you know what? I think I'm not going to be anti-Jew here. And they had that. But these people were the ones who said, no, we're Hamanites. He died, right? But this is why it's going to bring up his family first. Okay, we'll note that. So we're going to take how it now lays out what happened. And in Shushan, the citadel, which that is referring to the idea of it was a fortified place, so big walled city, palace, that all was in that. The Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. Now this was a large populous city. This is not like what would happen. That would typically happen with, you'd say you got a couple of 100,000 people, right? Well, that's 500. are who are in that. And this was where Haman was, where he had family and where the biggest people were. But now he's going to specifically describe them. Also, Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aradatha, Parmashta, Aridai, and Vajasatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, they killed. Notice it keeps coming up, the enemy of the Jews. That's why. But they did not lay hand on the plunder. It was about what they were trying to do and what they'd signed. Basically, these are the people, they signed on to this and didn't back off. And remember, with the way that the Persian political system worked, they had, because of that first decree, they had the right to go after the Jews. That was a bad idea. Now that this other, when before you can't defend yourself, Jews, now the Jews can have weaponry. That's what's implied in all this, right? They can have weaponry, they can have weapons to defend themselves. And also, this is a nation. How many Jews were there? Now, they had gone, remember, they're scattered throughout, but they weren't a small number of people. Compared when you take the 500, there were probably more Jews than that in Shushan. Yeah, yes. This is the only way for them to get anything back. Yeah, so, well, it's also revenge and all that kind of thing, is that look what you did to our dad. But yeah, so that's what you have going on here. But it's not all 500 were family. That's why you have the also. So you have all those that were kind of originally brought into this, but the family was first. But the important, they didn't lay hand on the plunder. Okay, now let's continue on with what goes on. On that day, the number of those who were killed in Shushan the citadel were brought to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the citadel and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. Or what is your further request? It shall be done. So he's all over, all this is flipped. What's necessary? Then here's the advice of why I had her down as a sage. Then Esther said, if it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Shushan to do again tomorrow according to today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. They're already dead. Put them up there to show here's what happens. So the king commanded this to be done. The decree was issued in Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. So that's a message. Yes. Yes. That's why when I said originally what Haman put together with the idea of what a gallows was, and doing that, there's that, what a hanging is. When we see hanging, we immediately think of the gallows in terms of rope and everything. But for them historically, it was more that you were taken, and this is what, remember, they were told to do to Haman too. But what you did is you took them out and stuck them on a big stick. And it served the same purpose of warning. And this, I go back, I think I mentioned this to you before, but at the opening of the first Pirates of the Caribbean, when Jack Sparrow's coming in, and they have it was a gallows hanging, and the whole point was, pirates beware. This is going to happen to you. That's what this was about, is that you go against us, here's where you're heading. And so it's very, very harsh messaging. Okay? But that's what it was. All right. So what do we have? You've got the gathering to defend yourselves. That's the next action. Then you fight, so then you have the success. And then you have an extension of the order. That indicates that in this place, you had a concentration of Hamanites, if you will. And we need to make sure we get all of them. That's what that is about. All right, so we get to verse 15 now. And the Jews who were in Shushan gathered together again on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men at Shushan. So not as many. But they did not lay a hand on the plunder. Again, repeated. So you've got a total now of 800 people within the city of which would have had the most problem. Okay? But that takes care of it. And the reduced number kind of indicates that, okay, this is good. They've done it. And it was to get rid of the people who wanted them dead and were going to work. You didn't want to leave that hanging. Pardon the pun. All right, so you have 300 more killed in Shushan. That completes the victory. Problem solved. Now, all of this is just based upon what the decree was that promised it. But that's what we get now, is it's done. But what do you do afterwards? There's always something that has to happen afterwards. It's recorded here in verse 16. The remainder of the Jews in the king's provinces gathered together and protected their lives. Okay, that was the aim. First aim, protect your lives. Had rest from their enemies, everybody stopped or was dead. And killed 75,000 of their enemies. So that's throughout the whole empire. 75,000 people they killed as a whole. And I said that was a big number, but the Jews would have outnumbered them. But again, third time, they did not lay hand on the plunder. It was never about money. It wasn't about wealth. It wasn't about advancing them as a people within the Persian Empire. It was about self-preservation. That's whenever you see these things go, and you need to interpret what they did, meaning the fighting and the killing, you need to interpret that with these markers in mind. It was about self-preservation. So you got it complete. It's complete throughout the whole empire. Not just Shushan, but everywhere. You've got the count, so they kept track, but they didn't take plunder. All right. So now verse 17. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar. Now, why does that matter, though? What's important about that day that he's now bringing that back in? It was mentioned earlier in the chapter, right, verse 1? But also where had it occurred before? The first decree, going all the way back to chapter 3. So the whole idea was that this is how everything turns out. And so by saying the day, he's actually incorporating the emotions where it began in chapter 3 of what was going to happen, and then incorporated chapter 9:1 of what would happen. And he's now putting that together. How should you feel about this? And on the 14th of the month, they rested and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Now, who is this talking about? Didn't it say that on the 14th in Shushan that they were still fighting? So what does this have to be talking about? Out in the provinces. So it was not as concentrated a problem throughout all the provinces, despite when you look at those numbers, that they were able to take care of all this the first day. And they had a natural reaction to it, which was the next day. So they're exhausted from all the fighting and all the tension and what that would mean. But that very next day, they rested. Okay? Which is not, it's like, well, yeah, you're not content, but you didn't fight again. So that's important. But it's not just that. It's also that they didn't work. They took that time and they put it into context, and they're not going to work. And as a result of that, what do you do instead of working on that day? They made it a feast. Made it a day of feasting and gladness. So again, we come back to, now we've got another feast going on. Okay? And that we notice how some feast, with the difference of Esther having instead a fast, has been part of all of what's happened. Okay? That's just a theme, a kind of a dramatic theme used throughout the book. So that now the feasting for the Jews was very different, but it's still feasting. Because it indicates something, it is associated with happiness in most ways. That it's a great day. We're gonna sit down and we're gonna have a good meal, right? As I was going to say, 1 month from now, Thanksgiving, you know? And that was it was the same principle when originally, is that we finally had a great harvest. Let's actually take a day to enjoy this. And so that's what they did, but we've been delivered, so we're going to take a day to appreciate this deliverance. And so if we didn't have that enough, then he adds, and gladness. So now you get your emotional satisfaction from you have the 14th day encompasses what happened, what was potentially going to happen, and what ended up happening. So the facts. The resting, which is natural but also saying this was significant. Feasting, which is associated with positive things but also fits it in within the overall the book. It's also communal. You could have a day of rest, as the Jews did for a Sabbath, but that was not necessarily a communal thing. It was done, everybody did it, but it was done more individually. The feasting was more of a communal thing. This is what we share in common, right? That we're all part of this. So we all are agreeing to rest individually, but we're also coming together to feast. Why? Because of gladness. Because something great and wonderful has passed. And when you especially put that within what could have been to how it turned out, that distinction, which is what good storytelling is, but it really should get a hold of you and say, where were you emotionally when the decree was first issued? And where are you now? And to think about this is that they'd spent this entire year with this hanging over them. Now, the good news is they only spent a few months with just the one decree. So they went for a few months, and I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where there was some time where it really felt like your life, and it was such uncertainty where you don't know what was going on, and it was a dangerous situation, and that you just felt like that. Let me tell you, it's not fun. And that you don't think you can do anything. But then even when you know this is coming, okay, now we can do something. Now I've got months, not just to prepare for the fight, grabbing whatever weaponry, fashioning weaponry, doing those kind of things, but I still know I've got a serious fight to the death in front of me. That was their year. So when you come down and you've had that kind of tension be essentially what that year was about, and when all of it finally is resolved, how would you react? You need an emotional release to match the tension. And that's what you have described here, is that how could we possibly, with everything that was coming out from us and against us, what we had to battle through, what this year's been like, can we express how happy we are today? Gary?
Well, it's likely that they had also prepared to be able to provide provisions to fighting men for more than one day. When the battle was
It's
over,
possible. They only had offer for the one day. Technically, they had to get extra. Remember, that was a separate decision from the king. So I would think that you would have to have had some provision. Yes, I don't think that they just said, "What are we going to do with all these leftovers?" Though, I don't think it was just that. I think that this is more we're going to make this a big deal. And they did that intentionally. So you've got Adar at the end of the year, I don't know, 13th. The 13th of Adar, official day of victory. That's when throughout the empire, even though in Shushan they needed an extra day, but throughout the empire, in one day they were able to take care of everything, so they had relief. So on the 14th day, they are celebrating. And they're doing so. And the thing that we get from all this, we'll have to go back, is that what would have gone in, they're celebrating a military victory, but it's also a time of reflection to think about what had to happen to make this happen. And that's why this book exists. Okay? So we've already talked about how the climax. I think this is not the climax. This is falling action. But it changes how you see the plot. That's what I want you to see, is know these markers. It changes how you interpret this behavior, and therefore the lesson you would learn from it. And that's why understanding plot is helpful, because it keeps you in line with the purpose of how it was originally written and what it was emphasizing and bringing up. It makes you more able to emphasize the right things and see it from that perspective. That's the real value of doing it in this way, or at least how I would argue it is. So when we come down, we're not going to get that unless you think I can do that in 1 minute. So we're going to save that. But what you look at throughout all of these things, and as they're laying out the story, they're going to now have time to say, what all happened here? Not only is their situation okay, they've now got 2 people highly placed in the Persian that are right next to the king. So when you began the book, you don't have any of that. But in what happened, first with putting Esther in that position based upon Mordecai's advice, Mordecai acting to push her to act, she acts, she thinks about it, is wise about it, works through this. You realize how many things that are unknowns that were outside of control had to happen to make this all work right? Vashti had to happen. It was the king's choice, based upon a bad decision. Choice of Esther, same thing. All these things, where you have to, as you go through the book, is to stop and think about how many things of individuals making choices had to go this way to get this outcome. And that's when we have a hint of trying to grasp providence. We'll pick up there next week.